She poured coffee every morning with her sleeve pulled down, hiding one tattoo, one secret, one life she swore she'd left behind. Then a plane vanished into the storm. Watch what happens when two Black Hawks land in a town of 400 people, and a commander asks her one question: what's your call sign? Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The rain had been falling over the small town of Larkspur, Colorado, for 3 straight days, turning the gravel lot behind Ruthie's diner into a shallow lake of mud and puddled neon. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease hung in the air like it had for 40 years, undisturbed by anything as trivial as weather. Behind the counter, a woman named Sam, that was the name stitched onto her apron, though it wasn't the name she'd been born with, poured coffee into a chipped mug for the 3rd time that hour. She wore a plain gray t-shirt with sleeves long enough to cover her left forearm, no matter how warm the kitchen got. Underneath that sleeve, hidden from every trucker, every retired rancher, every curious teenager who'd ever leaned across the counter to flirt, was a tattoo, a small black falcon diving through a stylized number 7, inked just above her wrist in a shop outside Fort Bragg 6 years earlier. Nobody in Larkspur knew what it meant. Nobody in Larkspur was supposed to. Sam had been waiting tables at Ruthie's for 14 months. She rented a small apartment above the hardware store, drove a decade-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, and volunteered on Sundays at the community garden behind the church. To the people of Larkspur, she was simply the quiet new girl who'd moved from somewhere back east, friendly enough, but private. A woman who flinched, just slightly, whenever a car backfired on Main Street, and who always sat facing the door. What the regulars at Ruthie's didn't know, what the sheriff's deputy who flirted with her on Tuesday mornings didn't know, what her landlord and her yoga instructor and the mailman didn't know, was that the woman pouring their coffee had once held the call sign Talon 7, and had spent 6 years as a combat search and rescue pilot with a classified Army aviation unit so quiet that even most of the military didn't officially acknowledge its missions existed. Her name, her real name, was Captain Elena Reyes. She had walked away from the Army 14 months ago. Not dishonorably. Not because she'd failed. She had walked away because of a mission in the mountains of a country she was still not permitted to name aloud, a mission where she had made a call under fire that had saved 11 lives and cost one, a young door gunner named Danny Ostrander, 23 years old, who had frozen for half a second too long, and who Elena had not been able to reach in time. She didn't blame the Army. She didn't even fully blame herself, not on her better days. But she had needed silence. She had needed a place where nobody called her captain, where nobody saluted her, where nobody needed her to be brave. She had needed a diner in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, where the biggest emergency most weeks was a grease fire in the kitchen or a tourist getting lost on the way to the ski resort. She kept the tattoo covered because the tattoo was the last visible thread connecting Sam the waitress to Captain Elena Reyes, and she had promised herself, the day she signed her separation papers, that she would let that thread go slack. She told herself she was retired. She told herself the falcon on her wrist was history, not identity. Larkspur had been chosen carefully, though nobody knew that either. It was small enough that nobody asked too many questions, close enough to the mountains that the wind and the altitude felt familiar in a way that steadied something in her chest, and far enough from any base or airfield that she was unlikely to run into anyone who might recognize the particular way she scanned a room when she walked into it, or the way her eyes always drifted to the exits first. She had built a life out of small, deliberate normalcies. She learned the names of every regular's coffee order. She planted tomatoes behind the church with the same careful attention she'd once given to pre-flight checklists. She let herself cry, exactly once, on the anniversary of the mission that had cost Danny Ostrander his life, alone in her apartment with the lights off, and then she had gotten up the next morning and gone to work like nothing had happened, because that was what she had trained her whole adult life to do: compartmentalize, function, carry on. Some nights, lying awake and listening to the wind move through the pines outside her window, she let herself wonder whether she'd made the right choice. Whether quiet was the same thing as peace, or just a different kind of hiding. She never let herself wonder for very long. Ruthie's diner had become, in its own small way, a kind of therapy she hadn't known she needed. There was something steadying about the rhythm of it, the bell over the door, the same 6 regulars ordering the same 6 breakfasts, the low murmur of a town that had never known war and never would. She liked that nobody here needed saving. She liked that the biggest crisis on any given day was a burnt batch of hash browns or a disagreement over whether the Broncos would make the playoffs. For 14 months, that smallness had felt like mercy. Ruthie herself, the diner's 71-year-old owner, had hired Sam on nothing but instinct and an empty booth's worth of conversation, never once asking for references beyond a driver's license and a social security number that, if anyone had looked closely enough, wouldn't have withstood much scrutiny. Ruthie liked to say she could read people, and in Elena's case, she'd read exactly one thing correctly, that the quiet new girl had seen more of the world than she let on, and that the kindest thing you could do for a person like that was let her set her own pace. Elena had let herself believe, slowly and against her better judgment, that the pace she'd set for herself might be permanent. She did not yet know that in 6 days, the sky over Larkspur would prove her wrong. It began, as these things always seem to, with a call that shouldn't have been urgent. The Larkspur Volunteer Fire Department received a report at 2:47 in the afternoon. A Cessna 206 carrying 4 passengers and 1 pilot had lost radio contact somewhere over the ridge line northwest of town, last known altitude descending fast through worsening weather. The plane had been flying tourists from a private lodge to a hunting camp 30 miles out, a short hop that, under normal circumstances, took 22 minutes. It had been 41 minutes since takeoff. No landing. No radio. No transponder. The storm that had been dumping rain on Larkspur for 3 days had climbed into the mountains as sleet, and now, as the search began, it was turning into something worse, a low, fast-moving system with visibility dropping toward zero and wind gusts the local forecasters hadn't predicted until the following morning. Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Webb, the one who liked Sam's coffee and liked Sam more than he'd ever admitted out loud, burst through the diner's front door soaked to the skin, radio crackling on his shoulder. "Sam, you seen the Fentons? Their boy was supposed to be on that hunting flight." Sam, Elena, felt something in her chest go very still, the way it always did in a half-second before her training took over. "What flight?" "Cessna went down somewhere past Widow's Ridge. Search and rescue scrambling, but with this weather nobody's got eyes in the air. Ground teams can't get through till the pass clears, and that could be hours. Could be tomorrow." Elena set down the coffee pot. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were completely steady. "How many souls on board?" Webb blinked at the word choice. Souls on board wasn't something civilians said, but he answered anyway, too rattled to notice. 5. Pilot and 4 passengers. One of them's a kid, maybe 10 years old. Elena untied her apron. "Sam. Where are you going?" Around them, the diner had gone quiet. Old Ferris Coulter, who'd been coming in for eggs every morning for 20 years, lowered his newspaper. The 2 teenagers in the back booth stopped scrolling their phones. Everyone in Larkspur knew the Fentons, and everyone in Larkspur understood, in the way small towns always do, that a missing plane in this weather was not a minor thing. "I need you to trust me for the next hour," she said, and something in her voice had changed, flattened, sharpened, the warmth of the diner waitress gone and replaced by something Webb had never heard from her before. "Get me every scrap of information you have. Last known position, heading, altitude, fuel on board, weather ceiling at the ridge. And get me a working radio." Webb hesitated, rain still dripping off his jacket onto the linoleum. "Sam, this is a federal search and rescue situation. There are protocols. People whose whole job." "I know exactly what the protocols are, Marcus." She had never once called him by his first name in 14 months of pouring his coffee. It landed harder than a shout would have. "I have flown search and rescue in weather worse than this more times than you've had this job. Right now every minute we spend arguing is a minute that plane's occupants don't have. So you can trust me, or you can watch me do this without you. Your choice. Sam, you're a waitress. Not always, she said, and pulled her sleeve up. The falcon on her wrist caught the diner's fluorescent light. Webb stared at the tattoo, uncomprehending, until Elena spoke again, this time in the clipped, procedural cadence of someone who had spent years in cockpits and command tents. Deputy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. My name is Elena Reyes. Until 14 months ago, I was a captain in a United States Army Special Operations Aviation Unit, rated in rotary wing search and rescue in exactly these conditions: low ceiling, high wind, mountainous terrain, zero visibility. I have flown missions in worse weather than this to pull people out of places you couldn't reach on foot for a week. Webb's mouth opened and closed. I am not asking your permission, Elena continued. I am telling you what I am about to do, because you are the only law enforcement officer in this town and you need to coordinate with whoever else is responding. Call your county emergency management office. Tell them a former Army CSAR pilot is available and requesting immediate contact with any military or National Guard rescue assets in the region. Do it now. Something about the certainty in her voice, the same certainty that had once made 20-year-old Private snap to attention, got through to him. Webb keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Webb. I've got a former military rescue pilot here at Ruthie's willing to assist on the Cessna search. Requesting you patch her into County EM immediately. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, skeptical. Say again, Deputy, a pilot? At the diner? Just do it, Carla. Trust me on this one. 20 minutes later, sitting in the back office of the sheriff's substation with a borrowed laptop and a topographic map spread across a desk still sticky with someone's abandoned soda, Elena Reyes was back in a world she thought she'd left behind: grid coordinates, wind vectors, decision trees for search patterns and degraded visibility. Her fingers moved across the map with a fluency that startled even her, muscle memory resurfacing after 14 months of dormancy like it had never left at all. Deputy Webb stood in the doorway, arms crossed, still processing what he'd just watched happen to the woman he thought he knew. You're really not just a waitress. I really am a waitress, Elena said without looking up. I just used to be other things too. Get me that weather data, Marcus. The county's emergency coordinator, a tired woman named Diane who'd clearly been fielding calls all afternoon, patched Elena through to the Regional Air National Guard Rescue Coordination Center almost as an afterthought, one more name on a list of well-meaning locals offering to help. That changed the moment Elena identified herself using her old unit designation and rank. There was a pause on the line. Then a new voice, sharper, more alert. Say again your unit and call sign. Captain Elena Reyes, formerly attached to 3rd Battalion, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Call sign was Talon 7. I've been separated from active duty for 14 months, but I am current on mountain CSAR procedures and I am on the ground 11 miles from the last known position of your missing Cessna. I have topographic familiarity with this exact ridge system, I did winter mountain training here. Another pause, longer this time. Elena could hear muffled voices on the other end, someone relaying information quickly. Copy, Captain. Stand by. She stood by for 6 minutes that felt like 60. When the voice came back, it belonged to someone new, older, calmer, used to giving orders that mattered. Captain Reyes, this is Lieutenant Colonel Dale Whitfield, Incident Commander for this search. We've got 2 Black Hawks from the Guard's High Altitude Rescue Detachment inbound from Buckley, ETA 35 minutes, but our lead pilot has never flown this specific ridge system and the weather's degrading faster than we like. You said you trained here? 2 winters, sir. I know Widow's Ridge like the back of my hand. There's a saddle between 2 peaks northeast of the last known position where downdrafts push aircraft off course in exactly this wind pattern. If that Cessna lost control, that's where I'd start looking. You willing to guide our crews in? Radio only, or do you want a seat? Elena didn't hesitate. I want a seat, Colonel. Send a truck. I'll meet your aircraft at the county airstrip. The sound reached Larkspur 11 minutes before the helicopters did, a low, rolling thunder distinct from the storm, a mechanical heartbeat that made every head in town turn skyward. They came in low, running lights cutting through the gray sheet of rain, two UH-60 Black Hawks flying in tight formation, engines screaming against a headwind that would have grounded most civilian aircraft. They banked hard over Main Street and set down on the gravel strip behind the volunteer fire station, rotor wash flattening the wet grass and sending loose trash cartwheeling across the lot. Deputy Webb's truck skidded up beside them, and Elena climbed out into the wind, sleeves still pushed up, falcon tattoo visible for the first time to half the town of Larkspur, who had gathered under umbrellas and store awnings to watch, disbelieving, as their quiet diner waitress crossed the tarmac toward two military helicopters like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Because she had. A crew chief met her at the door of the lead aircraft, shouting over the rotor noise. "Captain Reyes?" "That's me. Colonel's inside. He wants eyes on the map before we lift." She climbed aboard. Inside, the cabin was a controlled storm of its own, crew members checking gear, a flight medic securing a trauma kit, the low hum of radios cycling through frequencies. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with silver stubble and eyes that had clearly seen a great deal of weather like this one, extended a hand. "Colonel Whitfield. You're a hard woman to look up, Captain. Half your files redacted." "That tends to happen, sir." He almost smiled, though there wasn't much room for humor in his expression given the circumstances. "Your deputy back there says you've been slinging hash browns in his town for over a year. That true?" "Diner coffee, mostly, but yes, sir." "And before that?" "Before that isn't something I can discuss on an open channel, Colonel. But I can tell you I've flown mountain extraction in weather worse than tonight's, more times than I'd like to count, and that ridge out there is about as familiar to me as my own kitchen." Whitfield studied her for a beat longer than was comfortable, the look of a man doing rapid math about exactly how much trust to extend to a stranger who'd shown up out of a diner with a tattoo and a rank nobody could verify in real time. Then he seemed to decide something, and gestured her toward the map table bolted to the cabin wall. "Talk to me about that saddle." For the next 4 minutes, Elena walked him and his lead pilot through terrain she hadn't discussed with anyone in over a year, her finger tracing contour lines on a laminated map with the same steady precision she'd once used briefing missions that never appeared in any after-action report meant for public eyes. She explained the downdraft pattern, the false horizon effect the ridge created in low visibility, the narrow window of relatively calmer air along the eastern face where a struggling pilot might have tried to put a stricken aircraft down. Whitfield listened without interrupting, the way commanders listen when they recognize competence without needing it explained to them. "You want the left seat?" he asked when she finished. "I want whatever seat gets those 5 people found before dark, sir." "Fair enough. Co-pilot seat's yours. You call the terrain, my pilot flies the aircraft. Everybody comes home tonight, including you." The Black Hawks lifted off 6 minutes later, climbing into a sky the color of a bruise, engines straining against wind that buffeted the airframe like a fist. Below them, the lights of Larkspur shrank and vanished into cloud, and Elena Reyes, Captain Reyes, Talon 7, whichever name mattered in that moment, leaned into the headset and began calling headings into weather she had once trained an entire career to survive. The search pattern Elena called was tight and deliberate, hugging the terrain in a way that made even the experienced guard pilot beside her exhale sharply more than once. She had them fly the eastern face of the ridge first, low and slow, scanning for any break in the tree line, any flash of aircraft aluminum against the gray-brown slope. 40 minutes in, with fuel reserves ticking down and the light failing fast, it was the door gunner in the trailing helicopter who spotted it, a pale smear against a stand of lodgepole pines just below the saddle Elena had described, the unmistakable broken wing silhouette of a small aircraft that had come down hard but, crucially, in one piece. Contact, wreckage at your 10 o'clock, 400 meters. Elena felt something unlock in her chest, not relief, not yet, but the sharp focus of a problem that finally had a shape. "Colonel," That terrain's too steep for a full landing. We're going to need a hoist extraction. Copy. You've done this before. More times than I can count, sir. What followed was 31 minutes that the survivors of that crash, 3 adults and the 10-year-old Fenton boy, all injured but alive, the pilot conscious but with a fractured leg pinning him in the wreckage, would later describe, in interviews and in a hometown newspaper article and eventually in a modest local ceremony, as the most frightening and most reassuring half-hour of their lives. They would remember the deafening roar of the Black Hawk holding a hover in brutal crosswinds above the tree line. They would remember the hoist cable dropping through the rain like a lifeline from heaven. And they would remember, more than anything, the woman who came down that cable herself, because Elena had insisted on riding it down to assess the pilot's injuries and stabilize him before he could be moved, her dark hair plastered to her face, her sleeves soaked through, the small black falcon tattoo on her wrist the last thing the injured pilot focused on as she leaned close and told him, in a voice that somehow cut clean through the chaos, that he was going to be fine, that help was here. That nobody was dying on this mountain today. One by one, Elena helped rig each survivor for extraction, working with the same economy of motion she'd once used in places far more dangerous than a Colorado mountainside, until only she and the injured pilot remained. She rode up with him last, cradling his fractured leg against the spin of the hoist, murmuring instructions to the flight medic reaching down to pull them both aboard. The 10-year-old Fenton boy had been the hardest part, not physically but emotionally. He'd been trapped beside his unconscious grandfather for over an hour, terrified, soaked through, certain no one was coming. Elena had been the one to reach him first through the shattered fuselage, and instead of rushing straight to the hoist rig, she'd knelt beside him in the wreckage, rain hammering the broken windscreen, and told him in a calm, steady voice that she flew helicopters for a living, that she'd found people in worse spots than this one and gotten every single one of them home, and that he was going to have a story to tell his friends that none of them would ever believe. It was a small thing, 30 seconds stolen from a mission clock that had none to spare, but it was the thing that got the boy breathing evenly enough to be moved safely. His grandfather, the pilot, an experienced bush flyer named Walt Fenton who'd been flying this route for 11 years without incident, had taken the brunt of the impact, his leg pinned beneath a crumpled section of instrument panel. Elena worked methodically to free him, using a hydraulic spreader passed down from the hoist, all while the medic above shouted adjustments over the deafening wash of rotor blades 30 feet overhead. When the leg finally came free, Walt let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, and Elena held his shoulder against the stretcher and told him, flatly and without sentiment, exactly the kind of thing pilots say to other pilots in trouble: "You did everything right putting this thing down in one piece. Everybody's walking away from this. Hold on to that." By the time the last survivor was loaded and the Black Hawks turned back toward Larkspur, full darkness had fallen, and the storm, as if satisfied it had tested everyone involved as far as it intended to, began, finally, to break. The whole town, it seemed, was waiting when the helicopters set down again behind the fire station. Ambulances stood ready, lights washing red and white across wet pavement. Parents of the Fenton boys sobbed with relief as their son was carried from the aircraft, wrapped in a thermal blanket, exhausted but grinning. Elena climbed down last, soaked, exhausted, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the mission, because that was what it had been, whatever she wanted to call it, was over. Colonel Whitfield found her near the tail of the aircraft, watching the medical team's work. "Captain Reyes." He said it loudly enough that the small crowd gathered at the edge of the tarmac quieted to listen. "In 18 years of coordinating mountain rescues, I have never seen terrain reading like what you gave us tonight. That call on the saddle, that's the difference between finding those people and not finding them until spring. I just remembered the terrain, sir. You did more than that, and you know it." He studied her for a moment, the soaked t-shirt, the falcon tattoo still visible on her wrist, the woman half the town apparently knew only as a diner waitress. "I'd like to submit a formal commendation, but before I do, I need something from you. Something I imagine you haven't used in a while." "What's that, Colonel?" "Your call sign," Whitfield said, and there was no mistaking the respect in his voice, the way a commander speaks to someone he already knows deserves it. For the record, officially. What do we call you? Elena Reyes stood on the wet tarmac of a town that had known her only as Sam for 14 months, rain still dripping from her hair, the falcon on her wrist bared for everyone to see, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since the day she signed her separation papers, not the closing of a door, she realized, but the reopening of one she'd been afraid to walk back through. Talon 7, she said. Call signs Talon 7. Whitfield nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. Behind him, Deputy Webb stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the woman he'd poured his heart out to over diner coffee for months, seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. Talon 7, the colonel repeated. Welcome back, Captain. A ripple went through the small crowd gathered at the edge of the tarmac, not applause, exactly, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of collective exhale, the sound of an entire town rearranging what it thought it knew about the woman who'd been quietly serving them coffee for over a year. Ruthie herself had pushed to the front of the crowd, umbrella forgotten, staring at Elena with an expression somewhere between pride and disbelief. I knew it, Ruthie said, mostly to herself, mostly not caring who heard. I knew there was something about that girl. Elena managed a tired, genuine laugh, the first unguarded sound she'd made in front of the town since she'd arrived. You hired me because I could carry 4 plates at once, Ruthie. I hired you, Ruthie corrected, because you looked like someone who needed a place to be quiet for a while. Turns out I was half right. Colonel Whitfield cleared his throat, glancing at the ambulances pulling away toward the county hospital, lights fading into the wet dark. Captain, I'll need you for a full debrief tomorrow, but tonight, get some rest. You earned it twice over. Yes, sir. He hesitated, then added, quieter, meant only for her. For what it's worth, whatever brought you to a town this small, I hope you find whatever you were looking for. But the guard could use pilots like you. Whenever you're ready. No pressure. Just an open door. Elena watched him walk back toward the aircraft, rotors already beginning to spool for departure, and felt the weight of that open door settle over her, not as a burden, but as something closer to possibility. Ruthie's diner still smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease. The rain still came through Larkspur every few days, same as it always had. But the woman behind the counter no longer wore long sleeves in the summer heat, and when the sheriff's deputies came in for their morning coffee, they'd started calling her captain half-jokingly, and she'd started letting them. She hadn't re-enlisted, not yet, and maybe not ever. But she'd taken a position 2 counties over, training guard rescue pilots in exactly the kind of mountain flying that had saved 5 lives on Widow's Ridge, teaching them the terrain the way she once knew it, the way she still knew it, the way, she was beginning to understand, she probably always would. The falcon on her wrist stayed uncovered now, not because she needed anyone to know what it meant, but because she no longer needed to hide what it meant from herself. Some mornings, when the mountains around Larkspur caught the first light just right, she'd look up from pouring coffee and think about a 10-year-old boy who got to go home to his parents, about a pilot with a fractured leg who sent her a thank you card every month without fail, about 2 Blackhawks cutting through a storm nobody had predicted. And she'd think, some things you can retire from. Some things, it turns out, you just come home to. Deputy Marcus Webb still came in most mornings. He still ordered the same coffee, black, no sugar. But the conversation between them had shifted into something neither of them quite had a name for yet, easier in some ways, more careful in others, the way it always is when one person suddenly knows the whole of someone they thought they only knew in part. You ever gonna tell me the rest of it? He asked her one gray Tuesday morning, watching her refill his cup. The parts that were redacted? Elena considered the question the way she considered most things now, carefully, but without the old flinch. Some of it, she said. Not all of it. Some things aren't mine to tell. Fair enough. He turned the mug slowly between his hands. For what it's worth, Sam, Elena, whichever you want me to call you. This town's glad you landed here. Even before we knew why. She almost said something back, some deflecting line about the coffee or the weather, the kind of thing she'd have said 14 months earlier to keep a conversation from getting too close. Instead, she found herself saying something true. "So am I," she said. "Took me a long time to believe that, still working on it, some days." Outside the window, the mountains stood the way they always had, patient and enormous, holding whatever weather was still to come. And Elena Reyes, Talon 7, captain, waitress, survivor, whichever name the moment called for, poured another cup of coffee, and got on with the ordinary, extraordinary business of building a life she no longer had to hide.